In this talk, Zoe will be talking about many of the nutritional nuggets that we have forgotten or which we use inappropriate to explain the obesity-diabetes epidemic. She will expound on many of the nutritional myths that have been promoted in the last 40 years and which have caused the obesity-diabetes epidemic.
And thank you all of you for coming to this incredible inaugural event, challenging the way that we're thinking about food, nutrition, health and diet. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to essentially bust a few myths. And I think Tim may notice that I've ripped off already a brilliant book I've just read called Challenging Beliefs by Professor Tim Noakes. But I'm going to challenge 7 in this particular presentation. So here we go. The 7 that I'd like to challenge are the calorie formula, the mere idea that 1 pound equals 3,500 calories. The next idea that follows from that, if you create a deficit of 3,500 calories, you will lose 1 pound of fat. The idea that animal fat is saturated, that isn't even the case. Saturated fat causes coronary heart disease. Cholesterol causes coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease. Whole grains are healthy, and we need to eat our 5 a day. So let's kick off straight away with the first one. This is from the British Dietetic Association, one of their advice weight loss leaflets on how to lose weight and keep it off. And you can see here, this is the simplest statement of the calorie theory. 1 pound equals 3,500 calories. So if you eat 500 fewer calories a week, you will lose a pound over the week. Well, actually, no, you wouldn't. Even for people who believe this formula, you wouldn't, because if you did 500 fewer calories of activity, you would have no weight loss at all. So it doesn't even hold as written in their own book. But there are 2 more problems than that. First one is 1 pound doesn't equal 3,500 calories, and the second one is that you can't create that deficit. So where does the formula come from? Does anyone in the audience know where that formula comes from? Because I don't. I've got a guess, and I think this lady might be responsible for it. There's a great book called Diet and Health by Lulu Hunt Peters, dates back to 1918. You can get it on those websites that have the historical out-of-copyright books. And she may well be the person who invented it, because she actually says of those words, they are clever, I wrote them myself. So she's essentially saying if you cut back by a couple of ounces of fat, she puts it all in the metric terms, you'd lose 4 pounds per month, 48 pounds per year, cutting out 1,000 calories per day, then you're into, she's actually slightly out on the maths, cutting out 1,000 calories a day, you should lose 104 pounds. And it shouldn't matter whether you're male or female, 500 pounds to start with or 100 pounds to start with. I weigh about 110 pounds, let's say. I'm supposed to cut back by 1,000 calories a day and weigh 6 pounds in a year's time. I'm so glad you're laughing, but that's what we believe. That's what the calorie formula says, and it really is that nonsensical. Now, what tends to happen is if I don't know where something comes from and I want to know, I ask the people who should know. So in June 2009, I asked this esteemed bunch of organisations in the UK. You've got the National Health Service, the Department of Health, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which is our evidence-based body in the UK, dietitians, their body, Dietitians in Obesity Management, obesity forums, and I said to them, please can you tell me where this 3,500 formula comes from, and please can you tell me the proof for it, give me the evidence. Well, only about 4 even had an attempt. In most cases, it was trying to divert me off to the other one. So we had the Department of Health saying the department is unaware of the rationale behind the formula that you refer to. It's not my formula, I don't refer to it, it's your formula, you refer to it, you should be able to source it. The National Institute of Clinical Excellence, our governing body that is supposed to be responsible for evidence-based nutritional guidelines. And they came back and said, we also do not hold any information on this formula. Yes, although we use it in our publications, we also don't know what the evidence base is for it. So the 2 that had the best go were actually Dietitians in Obesity Management and the Association for the Study of Obesity. And they came up with one study. Independently, they came up with the same separate study. And this was actually a study of 12 people who were on a 600 calorie a day deficit diet. So they should have been, if you just apply the formula, Gary did it on Thursday, it's very, very easy. It should have been 600 times 365 divided by that, 62.57 pounds of fat lighter at the end of the year. They were, in fact, an average of 11 pounds lighter, and the range was 0.8 of a pound, which, as my husband often tells me, is just a good going to the toilet, and 17.2 pounds. But there should have been no range. Every single person, no matter the gender, the starting weight, the diet history, should have lost 62 pounds of fat alone, more in terms of water and lean tissue. And we have 1.5 billion overweight or obese people, and we cannot prove a formula in a study of 12 people. And that was giving the government every opportunity they could possibly have to prove that formula. So I think it's fair to say that they failed. So where might the 3,500 calorie theory come from if our government can't tell us? Well, let's just work out the maths. As Tim said, it's what I like doing. 1 pound equals 454 grams. Good starting point. Decimal places aside, that's a fact. 1 gram of fat equals 9 calories. Actually, no, it doesn't. We'll see in a sec. And 1 pound of adipose human body fat tissue is approximately 87% lipid. No, it isn't. But I've used those numbers because it's the closest that you can get to anything that looks like the calorie theory. Multiply those together, you get 3,555. But then you have the National Obesity Forum in the UK saying 1 fewer, again please, 50 calorie plain biscuit could help you lose 5 pounds over the year. No, it won't. You're out on the formula. The best cheating I can do to try and be as kind as I can to get to that number, you're out already. No biscuits involved. Now, what are the actual numbers? We'll stick with that one. Here's very interesting, without much effort at all, and I'm sure I could widen this substantially. You've got this number here, 8.7. That actually came from some work from Jequier Livesey, who was asked by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization to re-look at those calories per gram. And Livesey and his team of nutritionists concluded that it was actually much closer to 8.7 grams calories for a gram of fat. The 9.5 comes from a Wishnofsky paper in 1958. Sorry, I should have said actually all the references down here are on zoeharcombe.com/ZA2. So just make a note of the slide number and the reference number and you can look it up. So the Wishnofsky one is in there, and Wishnofsky said, I think that fat has got 9.5 calories per gram. So then we move to the next one. Now, the 87% lipid on the previous slide came from a 1911 paper by Bozenraad, but in the very same paper, Bozenraad said, I think the lipid content of human fat tissue ranges between 72 to 87%. So you can see what you can do now. You can plug in the lower end of those estimates, the Livesey estimate for the calories per gram of fat and the lower end of the Bozenraad, and this isn't much effort. You can work out 2,800 calories could equal a pound of fat, or you can take the upper end, and that figure was the exact number that Wishnofsky was working to in 1958. So he wasn't working to 3,500 calories. Now, if you think you can maintain your weight eating the number of calories in a pound of fat, so you currently think that that's 3,500, and it actually turns out to be 2,800, you gain 84 pounds every year. If you think you can maintain your weight on calories being 3,500 and actually you could have had 3,700, you're going to lose 26 pounds in any 1 year. This is so sensitive. As Gary showed us on Thursday, 21 calories a day, you become obese in middle age. You gain 20 pounds over the next decade. That's how sensitive it is. So talking of sensitive, the original numbers for fat, carbohydrate and protein calories per gram that came from Atwater and Rubner in 1901 were actually 4.1 for carbohydrate, 4.1 for protein and 9.3 for fat. Olive oil, they said, was 9.4 calories per gram of fat. So this has always been an imprecise science. And yet you pick up a magazine and they'll tell you 1 fewer mouthful of porridge over the next year and you're going to become Kylie Minogue. So notwithstanding that doesn't work, do we then lose any weight when we create a deficit, whether that's 3,500 calories or 3,700 or whatever it is? Well, no, and we have known this for almost 100 years. So Benedict in 1917 took 12 men, probably the first calorie deficit diet that we have documented. 12 men, tried to get them to lose 10% of their body weight over a month. He succeeded. He tried to get them to maintain. That was a little bit more difficult. The minute he said, okay, experiment's over, they regained all the weight in a couple of weeks and about 8 pounds more in a couple of weeks after that. Ancel Keys, yes, the very same Ancel Keys that we're slightly demonizing for the diet heart hypothesis, did the most brilliant Minnesota starvation experiment starting in 1945, published in 1950, took 36 conscientious objectors, put them on a 1,600 a day calorie diet with only about 45 minutes of exercise. That's pretty generous by today's standards. And over the 24 weeks, those men should have lost 78 pounds in fat alone. They, in fact, lost about 37. By week 20, they were plateauing. Keys had to continually keep taking the calories down and down and down until these poor men were on about 1,000 calories a day. Some of them were still not losing, some of them were regaining. The minute the experiment finished, they regained all the weight, plus about 10%. Now, when I've worked with people in weight loss, that's such a common story. I wasn't overweight until I did my first calorie-controlled diet. I lost some weight, put it back on, and then a little bit more. Lost some weight, put it back on, and a little bit more. So what we're showing you in this conference is the alternative, the one that does work. Stunkard and McLaren-Hume, 1959, reviewed all the evidence in the century up until that point, did their own study, and concluded that even when patients had quite a lot to lose, they didn't lose that much, and only a couple of % of people actually maintained any weight loss, which is what a successful diet is over any decent period of time. And I wonder if that's where the 98% of diets fail comes from. Maybe, maybe not. My favourite one is actually this chart from Franz and her colleagues from 2007. It's a study of 80 different diet reviews involving 26,000 people. You can look at the key later in your leisure. You've got all different kinds of interventions from diet alone, exercise alone. The very pale blue line, the eyes, of course, completely jump to this one. That's your very low calorie diets, your liquid diets. Don't get excited by this dark brown line. That's sibutramine, Reductil, which was taken off the market for cardiovascular complications. And actually, there was only one group still going at the end of this study, so that should have drawn a trajectory quite similar to the pale blue line. So you can see some sort of magic thing going on at around 6 months, which is exactly what Ancel Keys found, that there is this sort of sweet spot beyond which you don't lose more weight on a calorie-controlled diet, and there's this incredible drive for your body to try and regain any weight that you've lost. And Professor Nick Feinan first showed me this chart at an obesity meeting in Wales. And he said, I think all that we're doing is delaying the time that people break back through that barrier, but break back through it they will and gain, because we know that's what's happened since Benedict. So I wanted to impose the calorie formula on top of that, because on average, those were probably around 1,000 calorie a day deficits. Some of them would have been a much greater deficit with the low calorie liquid diets, some less with just diet and exercise alone. But it's not unreasonable to say they may have been trying to achieve a deficit of around 1,000 calories. So that's where the lowest was at about 6 months. You notice it's 6 months, 12, and then it breaks into years. So you're going to start seeing a bit of a kink in the chart. But actually, if you could extrapolate that back down, we're supposed to have lost 52 pounds at the 6 month point and 104 pounds at the 1 year point. And you can see what I've done on this chart. I've just squashed all those lovely little coloured diagrams up. I've taken it out to 4 years, which is how long all the studies were. And at 4 years, on the calorie deficit, the calorie promise, essentially, this is what this is. We should have been 400 pounds down, almost 200 kilos. In reality, those who stayed the course were lucky if they were about a handful of kilos down. Now, you can lose that handful of kilos in a couple of weeks on the kind of thing that we're talking about, and you don't have to go through that harm and that detriment to do so. So you will not lose a pound if you create a deficit, and it doesn't even equal 3,500 calories anyway. Now, moving on to saturated fat here, one of my bugbears actually is when people keep talking about animal fat being saturated and plant fat being unsaturated, because it's just wrong. It's just not nutritionally correct. I know from Christine's presentation this morning, you're a little bit reticent, I think, in shouting something out. I'm only going to ask you for one bit of input here. So please, would anyone like to shout out any of those products that have more saturated fat in them than unsaturated? Do you think it's all of them, a couple of them? Shout out anyone that you think. Olive oil we've had. You're not shouting, or I'm not hearing. Lard. No, there's no coconut oil, I'm afraid. The coconut oil would be great. I'm sorry, I should have said that's olive oil. So we've got olive oil, oily fish, eggs, nuts, lard, steak, and some low-fat milk. Eggs. Okay, so we've had just about all of them, except this one. The only food on that chart that has more saturated than unsaturated fat is the low-fat milk. Because the only food that has more saturated fat than unsaturated fat, or the only food group, is dairy products as a whole group. Okay. Now, before we move on to explain what I've just said there, I just want to highlight a couple of other things. We're told to avoid red meat, but to eat oily fish because of our two government guidelines, total fat and saturated fat. So this is the total fat in each product, the first number, and the second number is the saturated fat in each product. So this is our sirloin steak. You've got all the references on there. 7 grams of total fat and twice as much in the oily fish. And we have 2.1 grams of saturated fat, 1.5 times as much in the oily fish. Now, both are fabulous products, oily fish, red meat. I'm just trying to point out nutritional ignorance. Olive oil is just fabulous. I love this one because olive oil, of course, being 100% fat, has so much more fat and so much more saturated fat. Olive oil has 7 times the saturated fat of the sirloin steak that we're told not to eat. Oh, but you wouldn't have 100 grams of olive oil. People say, no, but a tablespoon of olive oil has got more saturated fat than a 100-gram pork chop. So I highly recommend looking at nutrients, looking at food, and just seeing some of the nonsense that's out there. What you need to know about saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat is that there are 3 real fats. We're not talking about trans fats in this conference other than to say they're evil, don't put them in your mouth. But there are 3 real fats. Now, why is it called a saturated fat? Because that's the general structure of a fat. They have the oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen atoms at one end, nice long chain of carbons, and all the hydrogens are in the right place. So we describe that structure as being fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. That's why it's called a saturated fat. It's the safest, most stable fat, generally, not least to cook with. When you start knocking out one of those, joining a double bond here, you knock out a couple of the hydrogen atoms, it becomes unsaturated. Monounsaturated, only one double bond is in there. Polyunsaturated can be 2 or more. So that's all that saturated fat is. Now, 2 things, please, take away about fat, saturated fat. Number 1, all foods that contain fat contain all 3 fats. There are no exceptions. No exceptions. Foods that contain fat include meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, nuts, seeds, olives, avocados. You'll even find a trace of fat. Start looking at food labels. Even on vegetables and fruits and grains, you'll start seeing traces of fat in some of those. Every food that contains fat has got saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. People talk as if somehow we can avoid saturated fat and eat polyunsaturated fat in its place. We can't. Only the proportions vary. Which brings us on to the second one. Dairy products are the only food group that have more saturated fat than unsaturated fat. Yes, coconut oil as a single oil has more saturated than unsaturated fat, but I'm giving you a general principle for a food group. There is only one. So it doesn't matter if the dairy is low fat, high fat, if it's skim milk or cream. It will have more saturated than unsaturated fat. But not that one is better or worse than any other, but just please to set the record straight. Now, we look here at a table. For those of you who are here on Thursday, I had a different way of picturing telling people about the macronutrients in food and also the fat content. So in this table, I've got a selection of foods from the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture database, and I've increased them in order of the fat content. So sucrose is not a food. It's a complete heap of junk. It's table sugar. It has no protein. It has no water. It has no fat. It has no nothing. It's just completely and utterly pointless. Down at this end, you have the 100% fats, lard and olive oil, no water, no carbs, no protein, but fat and all three fats. And then you've got some of the products going up, so a whole wheat commercial pita bread can actually also have more fat than our lovely pork chop. But then what you see here is you've got among that fat what's saturated, what's monounsaturated, what's polyunsaturated. The red, I've just picked out your top macronutrient, so you can see where it's mostly carbohydrate, mostly protein, mostly fat. And then in the green, I've picked out your top contributor of fat, where it's mostly saturated, or the top one is saturated, which will be the butter. And then, of course, you've got monounsaturated fat in lard, and you've got polyunsaturated fat in the fish here. Now, even here, where I've taken lamb fat, this is lamb fat, not meat, and you look at that and say, okay, so the single highest fat is saturated. It still has more unsaturated fat in total than saturated. So you still have that general principle, only dairy products, the butter, is going to have more saturated than unsaturated fat. So we're now looking at, does saturated fat cause coronary heart disease? And let's just have a very quick look at the epidemiology, because when we did the RCT paper, the randomized control trial paper last week, a number of people came and said, oh yes, but you should look at epidemiology. Well, actually the gold standard is looking at randomized control trials, but hey, let's look at the epidemiology. Great paper by Siri Terrano in 2010, looked at 350,000 subjects that was the follow-up year, 5 to 23 years, a follow-up of 350,000 subjects, pooled relative risk. But this is the important bit here. Intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease. We looked at age, sex, study quality, and it didn't change the results. So their overall conclusion was a meta-analysis, the gold standard again, of prospective epidemiological studies, that's just studying populations, show that there's no significant evidence for concluding that dietary fat, saturated fat, is associated with an increased risk of either coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease. So that's the epidemiology. This was our randomized controlled trial from last week. The dietary guidelines, remember, that were introduced, no more than 30% in total fat, no more than 10% in saturated fat, and no RCT had actually tested those government guidelines before they were introduced. So the Woodhill study, which came after the American guidelines were changed, Woodhill came in 1978, the American guidelines were introduced in 1977. Woodhill did actually test the 10% saturated fat intake, but there were 18% death rates in the intervention arm and 12% in the control group. So you were much better off being left alone in that study. And that was the only one that looked at it. When we looked then at total deaths, there were 370 deaths in the groups intervened with and 370 deaths in the groups left alone. So you don't need a risk ratio of 0.996% to tell you that you had no impact. There was no significant effect. And similarly with heart disease, there was no difference. You've got a risk ratio here of 0.989, so close to 1. And if you've got 1, it tells you that there's just no significance. This was an interesting finding because this could potentially undermine that whole diet-heart hypothesis. So if saturated fat is not associated with heart disease, but cholesterol goes down, then where does that leave the diet-heart hypothesis? Because cholesterol actually went down more in the intervention groups, and I think that was because of their oil consumption, phytosterols, plant sterols, for those of you who can take your minds on that route. For the rest of you, just enjoy the RCT results. Cholesterol made no difference. It didn't matter what cholesterol was doing. It didn't reduce overall deaths. It didn't reduce heart deaths. So the response to the paper, which was an immediate, yes, but we know saturated fat raises blood cholesterol and blood cholesterol causes heart disease, we haven't even got those two associated. So what this one in the middle is doing really doesn't much matter. And this is the one that just blew us away. As a research team, only 2,500, not even 2,467 males were studied over these trials. In almost all cases, they were not healthy males. They had already had a heart attack. So no women were studied. incredibly few healthy people were studied, and they were slotted in another study with unhealthy people. And yet then we went on to change dietary guidelines at that time for 276 million people, and of course probably 1 billion people have been affected since. And not one study actually called for change. So one of the studies says feeding oil isn't beneficial and may in fact be harmful. And my favourite one was the 1965 Research Committee low-fat study, which said, direct quote, "A low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction." That's just the old-fashioned word for heart attacks. Low-fat diet has no place. And we then changed those guidelines completely without evidence. Now, the next bit is actually for Jeff, because Jeff has been saying, you do know that there's an obvious follow-up, don't you? And it's like, yeah, we do know there's an obvious follow-up, and it's written already, don't worry. The obvious follow-up is to say, okay, that was then. Did we just get lucky? If we now look at all the randomised control trial evidence, does it justify those 2 dietary guidelines? And unfortunately, it doesn't. First of all, again, no study actually, or very few studies, tried to test those guidelines. So if you remember, we've got the Woodhill in the bank, the one that tested the 10% saturated fat, but nothing else. We've got the DART, the Diet and I forget the title of that, Diet and Reinfarction trial, thank you, tested 30% total fat, which was another one of the ones introduced, and had exactly identical all-cause mortality and coronary heart disease mortality, no difference. And those were the only 2 studies. We can bring the number of studies up to about 11 if we open up the pool to all studies available today, but they still don't provide the evidence. Now, when we pool them all today, we have an incredibly slight benefit towards leaving people alone for all deaths, and we have an incredibly slight benefit towards doing some intervention for heart deaths, but neither of those significant. So to all intents and purposes, all the trials that we've ever done playing around with dietary fat on different groups of humans have made no difference whatsoever. Again, we had the same finding with just one exception. This is not significant. The average cholesterol test, which I don't think I've heard yet over the last couple of days, is about 20% inaccurate, notwithstanding that you've got one equation with 4 variables, 2 unknowns, and only 2 you can measure. So you're in Mickey Mouse land from where I'm sat. But anyway, one didn't move, but all the rest did move, and yet it still had no impact on heart disease. This time we included 13,600 people. We did include women in one study, and one study was purely primary subjects, which means they hadn't already had a heart attack. They were generally considered to be healthy subjects, and that was the same France study. So all the RCT evidence we have today still does not say we should have introduced those dietary fat guidelines. So I don't have any epidemiological evidence or any trial evidence that saturated fat causes heart disease. The one interesting thing, and Asim mentioned this in his presentation yesterday, the one interesting thing that did have an impact was in the DART-Burr 1989 trial. They gave fish advice to one group of people, and that was the only statistically significant result achieved in the last 40 years of playing around with dietary fat. Oily fish is good for you, and as you now know, oily fish has twice the fat and 1.5 times the saturated fat of red meat. So have that as well as your red meat. My issues then with saturated fat and heart disease. We don't know what saturated fat is. Our governments, the UK government, call biscuits, cakes, pastries, ice cream. The American government calls sherbets, donuts, sour sweetbread, whatever. They call kind of waffles. They call these things saturated fat. You now know more than the UK and American governments, because you know that saturated fat is in everything that has fat, and you know that it's predominantly found in dairy products. We die without dietary fat. I don't know how long it takes. I'm not prepared to do the experiment personally. But because if we had 0 dietary fat in our diet, we would have no essential fats, and we would have none of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K, we would die. It's just a question of how long it would take. And given that you cannot eat fat without eating saturated fat, it's also not unreasonable to say you die without saturated fat. The totality of epidemiological evidence doesn't support it, nor does the RCT evidence. And I love this little quote from Dr. Malcolm Kendrick: association does not prove causation, but lack of association disproves causation. If A and B are not even related, you cannot claim that A causes B or that B causes A. They're not even associated. I just had a quick play before I came out here because I was getting really fed up with people saying, yeah, but we know saturated fat causes heart disease. So we have the data for Europe from the 2008 cardiovascular papers that come from Europe. Malcolm Kendrick actually did this in the Great Cholesterol Con with the 1998 Monica data. So I've just updated it for 2008. He did a thing in about 2 slides' time. That's the association for 44 countries in Europe between saturated fat as a percentage of energy in your diet and deaths from all causes. So from coronary heart disease. So the higher your saturated fat intake as a country in Europe, the lower your death rate from coronary heart disease. The lower your saturated fat intake, the higher your death rate from coronary heart disease. That's for men, that's for female. Now, for those of you who like Pearson correlation coefficients, that's pretty strong. A 0.6 association is pretty strong. You know, we can, with reasonable confidence, say that there's an inverse relationship between those two variables. Now, what Malcolm did was he took the countries in Europe from the Monica data with the lowest saturated fat intake, and then the countries, and they're probably quite similar countries, that's what they are in 2008, and look at that saturated fat intake. I mean, they are way below the 10% guidelines. These are really well-behaved countries. The average is about 5.8%. Here's the top 7, none of them getting anywhere near the 10% guideline. Their average is much nearer 15%. Of course, here you've got France, which singularly has the highest saturated fat intake in Europe and the lowest death rate from coronary heart disease. So if you take those top 7 and bottom 7 countries, those are the deaths in the bottom 7 countries. So per 100,000 men, you've got an average death rate of 117, and per 100,000 women, you've got an average death rate of 41. So then do it for the countries with the most saturated fat. They've got an average there of 39, and they've got an average there of 9. Now, what you notice, and this was the point that Malcolm made, and it still holds 10 years later, that the highest death rate that you can find in the high fat intake is still lower than the lowest that you can find in the low fat intake. And again here, the highest that you can find is still lower than the lowest that you can find in there. So you have clear water between those with the highest fat intake and those with the lowest. And in fact, the death rate for women in those countries with the lowest saturated fat intake is 4.5 times higher than those countries with the highest saturated fat intake. And for men, it's 3 times higher. And yet, the defense last week for saturated fat was quite staggering. Cholesterol, you can see I love these correlations and so on because I did it with cholesterol as well. I did this one a few years ago. Here's cholesterol. This is now for 192 countries. You can't get saturated fat intake for all the countries in the world, but you can get average cholesterol levels, and you can get total deaths and deaths from cardiovascular disease. So this is cardiovascular disease death rates and mean cholesterol levels in males. And you can see there's just a slight downwards trend. The R is nothing to get excited about, but it's not doing that, which is what we're told it's supposed to do. So the higher your cholesterol levels, the lower your deaths from cardiovascular disease if you're males. Do the same for females and it starts getting significant. So you get a much stronger downwards trend. The higher your cholesterol, the lower the death rate from cardiovascular disease. Now take it to all causes. So this is all deaths, males, and it jumps up again. So your R's getting even stronger. Higher cholesterol, lower deaths, lower cholesterol, higher deaths. And the winner is women for all causes. 0.73 on the R. Again, for those of you who like those correlations, that's a strong relationship. Now, when your doctor, as a female, next wants to put you on statins or next wants to lower your cholesterol, you may like to take that in and say, this is one of the nutritional nuggets that I got from that nice conference in South Africa, because what I want these nuggets to do is to be able to arm you to fight back against the nonsense that we're getting on a pretty regular basis. So again, if we can't even find an association between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, then how can we claim that there's a causation? 3 little questions. I just want to wrap up the fat and the cholesterol bit together before we move into the healthy whole grains and the 5 a day, because we all know they're right. 3 little questions. First of all, do you think that nature is trying to kill you? Because nature puts saturated fat in all the foods that it also has the vitamins and the minerals that you need to survive. So you cannot live and avoid saturated fat. In fact, to get all those nutrients that you need to survive and thrive, you need to eat those products that have the fat in abundance, not even just as an afterthought. So do you think that nature's trying to kill you? Do you think that your body's trying to kill you? Because your body is making cholesterol right now. Do you think there's a design fault and in some way it's out to get you? And if the answer to either 1 or 2 is yes, do you know what paranoia is? Right. Healthy whole grains. I did a different version of this slide on Thursday. We were talking about how you make food choices, and my principle is very much just eat real food and choose food for the nutrients that it provides, and you will end up eating the right things. And I put up a chart that showed where the right things are. So when people say to you, you know, whole grains are really healthy and you need to eat your whole grains to get all of those nutrients, well, let's just look at the facts. So here's a table where we have just some foods that I've picked out because I know that they're fabulous: liver, sardines, sunflower seeds, and then I've taken 3 really super healthy whole grains. So we've got whole wheat flour, brown rice and oats. And these are just the vitamins to start with, and it's all per 100 grams of product. And I've put in red the product that basically wins for that row. So the highest calorie product in that row is the sunflower seeds, the highest protein quality is liver, and then you can pretty quickly see that liver is the single healthiest food on the planet. And I don't know if Gail is in the audience today, but Gail came to me afterwards and said, I think oysters could well compete. They don't. I checked it this morning. Go to the USDA database. The links are all there. Put in any food you want. If you find one better than liver, do let me know, because I'm really prepared to change that slide, but I haven't found one yet. It'd be maybe some other offal, kidneys or whatever, but it's offal. And then, of course, sardines are fantastic for vitamin D. I often wonder how people get their vitamin E if they don't have some sunflower seeds daily, because you can just see the other foods don't even come close. But you'll notice that nothing won on the healthy whole grain side. They just didn't win any of those categories. They were all won by the kinds of things that people on this platform, and hopefully a lot of you in the audience, eat on a regular basis. So that's the vitamins. When it comes to the minerals, and bear in mind that whole grains come from the ground, minerals come from the ground. This is where you'd expect these guys to do really quite well. Again, they don't do very well at all. It's sardines, sunflower seeds, and liver cleaning up for iron. You've got whole wheat flour here doing pretty well for manganese. That's not something that you'll generally struggle to get. And I put up on Thursday, I should have added it in today actually, that I put in cocoa powder in this column, and then of course the whole of the cocoa powder column went red and everything else went black, because when it comes to minerals, cocoa powder cleans up. So any chocoholics in the audience who want the nutritional nugget excuse to eat chocolate, it is that. Cocoa powder is absolutely awesome for zinc, iron, magnesium, copper, all the minerals that we need in our daily diet. So again, next time somebody says to you, you need to eat your healthy whole grains, you really mustn't be having that meat and fish and all that naughty stuff. You might want to take along that chart and say, really? Because it doesn't look like it to me. And the final slide is 5 a day. Now, I've sort of become a bit known for this, really. I did a blog on 5 a day not really being evidence-based, and then whenever 5 a day comes up, or there is a new study saying it should be 7 a day, or it should be 2 a day, or whatever, they do some surfing online, and they tend to come across me, so I end up on Sky News and that kind of thing. But it is a fairy story. Now, it started in 1991. It started in California, at a meeting of the National Cancer Institute for America and about 25 fruit and veg companies. So the blueberry people were there, the potato people were there, logistics of moving vegetables around America people were there. McDonald's were interestingly there. I don't know what McDonald's were hoping to gain from 5 a day, but they were there. And you can kind of get the idea that by the end of the meeting, somebody said, well, look, let's have an outcome. What if people ate more fruit and veg? Can we come out with a sort of slogan, maybe 5? Would that seem achievable, where it's the number of fingers on one hand, and maybe it's quite memorable? As often happens when something isn't evidence-based, it then, of course, mutates. So I think they've got 4 a day in Ireland. I think they've got 6 a day in Denmark. I think Australia have gone to 7 veg and 2 fruit or something. And it's just gone crazy. But this is across 3 continents and 25 or so countries. This is the single best known nutritional message globally. And it's not evidence-based. It's based basically on that meeting. So why would it have come out? Now, Cancer have since trademarked the term. The National Cancer Institute have trademarked the term 5 a day, so they own it and they protect it quite rigorously. So you would think that they had come to the table with evidence that it was going to help cancer, and therefore it was something that they wanted to push out in the interests of cancer. Now, one of the things I love is that all of this 5 a day was first coined in 1991, which was the same year that the EPIC study was started, which was the European Prospective Investigation into Cancer. So you can kind of get the picture of, we've come out with this 5 a day and we think it helps cancer, we better start this massive prospective study across Europe, and it is massive. It's 500,000 people, 23 odd countries, and they're trying to see if fruit and vegetable intake makes any difference. Well, they published their results in 2010, and the results for the whole of the European study, and fair play to them for honestly reporting the results, because from 91 to 2010, you can imagine that they would desperately want to be able to come out and say, we have the smoking gun, we have the fruit and veg and cancer, to do all of that research and not even to be able to fiddle the stats to say there is a relationship, let alone a causation, must have been galling. So fair play to them for coming out and saying it how it is. And Paolo Buffetta, in the publication in spring of that year, said, even when we looked at the lowest intake of fruit and vegetables, like not even 167 grams a day, and we looked at the highest intake, the guys having up to 1 kilo a day, there was not even an association between cancer and the fruit and veg intake. And again, fair play to Tim Key from the UK arm, who said in November, we've been studying this for over 30 years, but no protective effects have firmly been established. And yet we tell everyone to have 5 a day. Now, the next question you need to ask is, of course, well, so what? Surely it's a good piece of advice. Even though it's not evidence-based, surely it's a good nutritional nugget. Well, no, it's not. And first of all, I would like people to stop saying fruit and veg in the same sentence, because they could not be more different. Veg is great, particularly the green leafy stuff, less so the starchy stuff. Fruit is just sweets. It's just sugar. And it's sugar with a little bit of nutrition, but really not that much. If I'd have put an apple in on that chart with the liver, the sunflower seeds, even the healthy whole grains would have beaten the apple. It really isn't bringing that much to the table. And fruit and obesity, as Gary Tobes is famous for saying, if you're overweight, fruit is not your friend. Because it's just sugar. The body doesn't know if it got the glucose from the banana or the glucose from a confectionery bar. And my final one is fruit and treating people like fruitcakes. That's my biggest objection to this whole thing. The idea that we treat people like idiots, that we can just tell them 5 a day is a healthy message for people to have, and they'll go away and follow it, and things will change, and the evidence was not there in the first place, and the evidence has not been found since. Bit of a pattern there, you may notice. Now, we have 5 a day coordinators. We actually have people employed by governments as 5 a day coordinators. Now, I put it to you intelligent people, we may as well have tooth fairies. In summary, I'm doing quite well, I've got 2 minutes to go here actually, so in summary, 1 pound does not equal 3,500 calories. With very little effort, you can make it equal 2,8, 3,7, and probably any other number. Do go away, have fun, and play with it yourself. If you create a deficit of whatever number you choose, you will not lose a pound of fat. It has never, ever been achieved since 1917. It will never be achieved. in any period in the future. It just is not a formula. And I have people saying, oh, but people want a formula. And they do want a formula, but I'm sorry, I want a red Ferrari. I can't have a red Ferrari. There isn't a formula. We've just got to accept that we have lied to people, telling them that if they create a calorie deficit, they will lose guaranteed 1 pound of fat. It's the cruelest lie we have ever told slimmers in the history of the universe. It's hideous. Animal fat is not saturated. You know that now. All fat, all food that contains fat contains all 3 fats. Only dairy products have more saturated than unsaturated. Saturated fat is actually inversely associated with coronary heart disease, just as cholesterol is inversely associated with cardiovascular disease. Whole grains are nowhere near as healthy as other foods we could be eating, and 5 a day is a myth, not a nutritional nugget. I think this is a nutritional nugget. Mark Twain, what a genius. It's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment. We're trying to convince the world that they've been fooled, but we're finding that it's still much, much easier for the people who are continuing to try to fool us. So thank you very much for listening. You've been a delightful audience, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you.